Welcome to OGGN Oil Talk, the official podcast of the Oil and Gas Governance Network, OGGN. Our topic today is Oil Wealth, Broken Systems, an early look at factors in the MV Barima ferry sinking. Our guest is Anand Persad, Editor-in-Chief of Kiskadi Watch, former Editor-in-Chief of the now defunct Stabroek News. I'm your host, Janet Volkan, and we're thrilled or happy to have you tuning in today or this evening. OGGN, the Oil and Gas Governance Network, was founded in the summer of 2017. It's composed of Guyanese at home and abroad. OGGN is a registered 501c3 nonprofit in New York, USA. OGGN recognizes that oil, petroleum will feature prominently in Guyana's future for decades to come, which is why we are committed to thinking long-term. OGGN's mission is to advocate for the rule of law, environmental protection, and strict financial norms when it comes to oil exploration and production in Guyana. Whether you're listening locally or you're one of the many Guyanese living in the diaspora or someone who is interested in Guyana and loves Guyana, our goal is to keep you informed and educated. OGGN is independent with no political affiliations, and we actively advocate for transparency, accountability, and good governance. So, Mr. Persad, today is one of the 3 days marked for national mourning for the perhaps 100 persons or more or less, around 100 persons who drowned when the MV Barima capsized and sunk on the night of 18th of July around midnight. Members of OGGN, we mourn alongside families and friends of those who lost their lives. And we offer more than perfunctory condolences. I still feel as though I am with fellow travelers enveloped in that blanket of grief. So there are many things we can talk about, and we have limited time. I know you have limited time, so thank you for joining us, Mr. Persad. And I thought I could begin by thinking of these global comparisons we hear of our country, Guyana. So we hear, for example, fastest growing economy, and other superlatives. I think we heard the best airport in Latin America. Recently, I heard that one. So I wanted to ask you about another global tragedy, which commentators have been comparing the MV Barima sinking to, and that's the Titanic. So that was in 1912, years ago. And after that, we had the global standards were revised to protect passengers at sea. Mandatory life jackets, lifeboats, inflatable rafts. We don't even know, in the case of MV Barima, how many passengers were on board. What we know about the Titanic, though, is that 67% of its passengers and crew drowned. Proportionally, I think we probably can think that they were in the majority citizens of the UK, United Kingdom, and or the USA. I think we can assume that most of the persons who drowned in MV Barima were Guyanese. So I'd like to hear from you in terms of prorated to Guyana's population. Of course, that's a state secret. We still don't know the results of the 2022 national census. But how would you rate the sinking of the MV Barima with this global tragedy we all know about, the Titanic?
Yeah, thank you, Janet, very much for this opportunity to be on. I welcome it, and I think the work that OGGN is doing is fantastic. So the Titanic. I would not want to go back to 1912. This had to do with Titanic and an iceberg, in a very developed part of the world just prior to the First World War. Completely different arrangements and atmosphere and conditions and so on. I don't think we should get away at all from the fact that this here was gross negligence. So what we've had here, we shouldn't even try to use it as a comparator to anything else, because it is clear what has happened here must be focused on for what it was, which was This here was a vessel that had absolutely no rhyme or rhythm, being in service 87 years after it was born. And the fact that it was plying this route and had to take a journey on part of the sea, the Atlantic Ocean, during a very rough period, that is completely unforgivable. And considering that we've been generating oil revenues since 2019, which is, virtually 7 years ago, we were approaching 7 years, that definitely should have been decommissioned and replaced. Now, the fact that it wasn't is horrendous. So there are several other things about this trip that shouldn't be ignored. And there's, of course, it bears no comparison to Titanic. Titanic was an iceberg that you couldn't really predict what was happening. In this instance, you could have predicted what should have happened here, which was there was absolute chaos as it relates to how many people were meant to be on board. There was a separate system apparently for booking online, which was not integrated with the system that allowed people to go and sign up manually. So that you have one tranche of people signing up online, and then you have another set of people going in manually. Nobody's comparing, nobody's saying, okay, well, we have 60 in here, we can only take 30 more there, and we're going to monitor. It is just chaos. And so you ended up with them first saying 116, then adding 17 crew and making it 133, and then now going to maybe 179. In any circumstance where you could not account for maybe 42 passengers, or you found an extra 42 passengers on board, and only after a catastrophe, it shows how close we were dicing with danger all along, and that is completely unacceptable. The packing of the cargo was another instance of gross neglect and negligence. Enough survivors have testified about heavy pieces of equipment, crates falling upon them because these things were not secured, and the improperly packed cargo is probably going to be one of the factors in why this thing was not able to right itself after being struck by a wave. Most of these seagoing vessels are meant to be able to sort of like to accommodate and cushion waves and sort of get back on even keel, but that apparently was one of the really sort of severe reasons why it was not able to get back in the righted position. And then you also have this fact about the crew having been under the influence of one or another thing, either narcotics or in other cases, some of the survivors have told us about alcohol consumption. So there are very many things that went wrong. And even to try to draw a comparison with another tragedy is to escape from having them focus on exactly what went wrong here and what they are meant to be. And I think I have pointed this out, we pointed this out on Kiskadee Watch in one of the news items we have done. On the very day this tragedy occurred here, there was a similar smaller tragedy in St. Lucia, July 18th. They have already set up a commission of inquiry, and they have made sure that they have somebody from the judiciary, and they've had other people that they could sort of have confidence in. We are still dilly-dallying on this. That is, up to yesterday, when the question was asked of the Prime Minister, he's not in no position to say where it's at. So they need to get to the stage where they can have a credible commission of inquiry, which is not the one that they did for the Madia incident. And they will have to get on the road very quickly with this, because evidence gathering is an important thing. And the longer you wait, the more difficult it is for you to be able to get it going.
Thank you, Anand. The reason I mentioned the Titanic was to draw attention to the magnitude of lives lost and the fact that, we've had so many conventions now to protect safety of life at sea, SOLAS Convention being one. I think we're both Guyanese, you and I, so we know that in our lives, in the life of Guyana, race and class loom large. And so I think this is one of the things which is now debated, with the ways in which we know with the Barima, in the case of the Titanic, only 24% of the people in third class, the steerage class, survived. And here, in terms of Guyana, I'm going to just read quickly what the wife of the Diane Court, the wife of the canteen operators, had to say about this boat. She, for over a decade, has been at it with its loading and unloading. And she said, I came off the boat about 2 minutes before it left. Normally, it is supposed to leave at 1 p.m., but it never leaves at 1 because there is always so much cargo to load. She said passengers were already on board while the generators, that he talked about generators, were still being loaded. And it was common for passengers, particularly Amerindian travelers, to be displaced from upper deck seating because cargo occupied so much space. Kaichua News quoted her words. She said, "We don't normally see them upstairs, them being Amerindians, like that. It's a regular thing. Sometimes many Amerindian people have to come downstairs because the cargo takes up so much space. I just feel sorry for them," she said. 2 months ago, the 25th of May, Mr. Roshan Khan, who is a well-known Guyanese, posted a screed on social media. He was bewailing that the same Minister of Public Works, One Edge Hill, had consigned him to sit below deck with the hoi polloi while he was on his way to the 60th anniversary celebrations, our independence celebrations. And he had to get the spray, like all the hoi polloi below deck. So what do you think? What do you make 114 years after the sinking of the Titanic? All our talk of one Guyana. Our motto is one people, one nation, one destiny. What do you make of the comments, all the angry commentators on social media who say that Amerindians are customarily made to take the spray on the lower deck, to lie on the floor, to sleep on the floor, and to make way for cargo on the upper deck? And Amerindians are saying, and you must have seen it, I see it, everyone sees it on social media, more insistently now on social media, that they are treated as second-class citizens in their own country.
Yeah, well, it's certainly taken for granted. And I think if you reflect on it, it would be evident again that the government really has shown no serious interest in the plight of hinterland communities and communities, in the Northwest and, in the interior and in the Ruknuni and so forth. Had they evaluated what kind of impact oil revenues can have on the quality of life of people in those areas, the first thing they would have alighted on is transportation. Transportation and the Northwest transportation has been legend for years as it relates to the kinds of trials and tribulations for people who are traveling on the Northwest. The ferry journey on the Barima, sometimes it takes over a day, maybe 20, 28, 30 hours sometimes. And that's if the engines don't feel or work slowly or whatever it is. So this has been legend. That is, they have to sleep rough and hard. There's hammocks. If there are no seats, they have to sleep on the ground. And this has been going on. So I cannot see how this government has been in place for more than 6 years, because you're talking 2020 to 2025 and then this new term that they're in, that it never would have occurred to them that this here is just inhumane and should not be allowed. And that's why some of the people who've commented on this thing have said, if those ministers and the upper class people had to travel on a ferry like this, it wouldn't have survived for a long time. But the fact that Amerindians and others who are depressed and who are forced to take these sort of options because there's nothing else, that's why this has continued. And so the government has filled itself with all of these grand schemes of 4-lane highways and all of the other grandiose infrastructure and supporting hotel construction wild across the place and so on, without looking at what you can actually do to lift the standard of life of people who need to travel between Georgetown and Mabaruma and Port Kaichuma. Now, one of the things they did do, and this is something that was originated under the Ramatara administration, this was, India had offered to supply a vessel for the Northwest Front. And so that in itself was a good thing. And it was offered before we found oil. So it was during the period of, let's say, 2014 and so on, that, we definitely needed the help. And India stepped forward with a line of credit, and Ramatara said yes. And it was left there. And when APNU AFC came in, that project was just simply taken off. And then it was restored when Ali returned. But so it was good that it was there. But what happened with that project? And it shows again about the need for proper planning. That is, if you were going to get a new vessel, it needed to be fit for purpose. It needed to have sufficient cargo space. You then needed to determine whether or not it was going to be dual cargo and passenger, or it was really just for passengers, and then you'd have other cargo ships going. So this MV Malaysia started operating in August of 2023. And what the constant cry from people who were living in the Northwest was that it did not have sufficient cargo space. That is, it was limited. So the specifications that we took were not suited to the Northwest Run. And it was one of those things that shows no matter what you're taking, even if it's a gift horse, you have to make sure that you're at least getting what is going to be suited to your needs. That is, I need to have excess cargo space, or I need to have more room for passengers and so on. So that became a problem. That is, it was insufficient for cargo. In January of 2025, one of the intrepid reporters from Starbuck News, Khadija Ba, took a trip on MV Malaysia. It was 15 hours long, and when she came back, she did a story that said, people at Mabaruma at Kumaka have complained that this thing doesn't have enough storage space, enough cargo space. And within days, in his budget presentation, Minister Edgehill announced that MV Kimbia would be restored to the service to help to ease that. So again, it showed how the planning was so poor that they didn't know that they needed to have more cargo space. And it was only after that they pressed Kimbia and then maybe restored Barima to that route. And of course, Old Barima. But if you were really looking to improve the standard of living of people there, you would have made sure you have 3 or 4 modern ferries and you would have been able to do it. He did say then in that 2025 budget speech, we're going to get 2 new ferries from Greece. One of them arrived last year, and earlier this year, one of them arrived, and then they said it's going to be utilized for some expedition for the 60th anniversary of the country. So in May, it was used for that, but it hasn't yet been deployed to the Northwest because obviously they didn't retrofit it or they didn't have test runs on it and so on. So again, it showed that, they haven't been sort of like expeditious in the way they sort of did their work. But you would have made these changes a long time ago had you been aware of the suffering of people on this particular ferry.
So suffering of people, Anand, I think gestures to what this has made clear, the drowning of perhaps 100 Guyanese, 100 souls, including many children, which is the differential treatment of different classes of people. Sleek highways for 4-wheel drive vehicles and the utmost modern vehicles versus 8 to 9-year-old ferry for the hinterland. And I think it also gestures to a broader mistreatment of the population and the normalization of abuse. So a week before the sinking of the MV Barima, lots of us saw both leader of the opposition, Azruddin Mohammed, Terence Campbell, member of parliament and leader of the APNU party, both parliamentarians. They highlighted the plight of 300 pregnant cows, abandoned, it looked like, or just stranded on the left bank of the Berbice River. In all of the footage, no cow minders were in sight, nobody putting some spray, even sea spray would have been welcome on these cows. I saw at least 2 cows which had died in these containers, waiting for preparations to be made for them to cross over to Ibini. What can we draw from these examples in 2 consecutive weeks of our national attitude or political attitude or attitude to human rights, rights of animals, treatment of civility to each other?
Yeah, so there's a great uncaringness. You can see it in this government, and it is exemplified in so many ways. So this question of the transport of the heifers really sort of speaks to a serious occurrence that needs to be further explained. That is, this here supposedly was a tender for the supply of cattle. And it was supposedly won by a businessman in Brazil. Now, you would know that even if you are supplying livestock from Brazil and you consider the distance, you would have to sort of make preparations for a holding station at some place until, once they cross the border, across the Takatu, they're there in some holding place. You're not going to bring them all the way from the Takatu in one full journey and just simply sort of deposited them across the Berbice River at Ibini. because clearly that would be punishing and it would increase the mortality rate and so on. So all of that shows lack of preparation. I don't know if veterinarians sort of assessed the whole thing along the way, but clearly, and this is one of the good things about the opposition, they were alert and they pursued this, both APNU and We Invest in Nationhood, and they were able to show this. Now, it is also tied into the larger question of what really is happening here. That is, all of a sudden, all of this cattle is coming from Brazil. Is there no other way? Should we have been looking at some other type of contract to fulfill what our needs were? And it's sort of like folded into the scandal that had arisen about the president's farm, because the president's farm had been exposed in the days prior. And so people were saying, well, the president's farm has black belly sheep, which were supposedly part of the shipment that had come from Barbados some time ago. And, so questions arose. Were some of these heifers intended for the president's establishment so that when the truck was journeying from Brazil, it perhaps might have stopped someplace, on the Soos-Dijklinden Highway, and maybe heifers would have come off or whatever it was, and it would have been allocated to that farm, and maybe it would have been kept there. But the fact that you would simply have those animals be punished all the way from across the Takatu, waiting at the Ibini, at the point of the Berbice River to cross the Ibini, using makeshift planks, which when you looked at it, if I were those heifers and I knew that I was going to be crossing, I would seek, an escape route from those trucks right away and whatever it is. And in the heat and in those cramped conditions and in the kind of state that they were in pregnancy and so on, clearly those would have been gross violations of animal health conditions, and but they obviously showed no interest in it. And it was clearly exposed by the fact that the opposition were there and so on. I think they admitted that 3 heifers died, and they said, oh, this is covered by the insurance that is going to be applied to the supplier. But I'm sure the mortality on the ground could have been higher after that, because from that type of journey and that type of exertion for pregnant animals, it could have a much higher mortality. But it was the way in which it was done and why it was done like that without veterinarians all along the way trying to improve the health and to keep checks on whether or not these animals were in a good state for further travel. And it was also something that had been explored by Kiskadee Watch as it relates to how it was that cows were procured from Brazil to be slaughtered at Anvoact on the West Berbice, because that could not be explained. And up to now, it has not been explained, even though we have pressed the Ministry of Agriculture, we have pressed the Guyana Livestock Development Authority. Under what circumstance could animals be brought all the way from Brazil simply to be slaughtered at Anvoact? That is something that is the typical jiggery-pokery that has not been explained. And so I think they have gotten into some kind of chain and sequence from Brazil that sort of like allows them not to be concerned with animal health. What they're concerned with is whichever deal that was struck and whichever procurement, whether or not in compliance with the law, but that's really what transpired. And they're not concerned with the health of animals or the things appearing to be done correctly.
And I think we're not going to belabor the poor animals today, but in of the apex of power. And so persons lower down, institutions lower down, are not informed, and so they will not perform even what are their regulatory duties or their regular admin duties, because they've been kept out of the picture.
Yes.
They're just there at the last moment for the photo ops to keep their job and make some kind of anodyne statement. And then I'd like to move on to to Article 147 of our Constitution, which protects freedom of assembly, freedom of association, freedom of demonstration. And this particularly has to do, of course, with freedom of the press. You mentioned Khadija Ba, who on the Sunday, just a few hours after we woke up to hear what had happened at sea, just 7 miles off Iron Punt, at a place called Iron Punt, off the coast. And Khadija Ba had gone to the Umanayana. She was at this point, she's a journalist for Culture News, and she said Minister Kwame McCoy and his assistant Derwin Wills, who was standing behind him, summoned a brown clothes policewoman and a plainclothes police officer and told them to remove me from the premises, not just from the Umanayana, but from the yard. And when I read that, Anand, I was just, it broke me because I know Khadija Ba is beloved. She's beloved by people in Region 1. She's beloved by communities in Upper Mazaruni, Region 7, Region 9. She's one of the Guyanese, you might say a coastlander. I don't know if she's a coastlander, but who is that bridge between our coastal people and our hinterland people. And so that Khadija Ba could be denied access to the grounds of the Umanayana, our unifying national symbol, is for me, I'm still trying to come to terms with it. And you, of course, Kiskadi Watch you have a video showing Minister Frank Anthony ordering a Kiskadi Watch reporter to leave the premises. What can you tell us about what you think about this broader muzzling of the press at this moment, or more broadly?
Right. So it's all typical, so it's Article 146 and 147, freedom of expression and freedom to gather information, and of course, freedom of assembly and freedom of protest. So Article 146 is our key thing there. So at the Umanayana that day, it wasn't only Khadija, it was a reporter for Kiskadi Watch, a reporter who had formerly been at Starbuck News by the name of Chantal Glasgow. She was with, or near to Khadija, and they were both ordered out by Minister McCoy. So I would like to advise, Minister McCoy is meant to be, I think, the featured speaker at an upcoming Caribbean Broadcasting Union event here. I would de-recognize him if I were the Press Association, and I would castigate him and condemn him for disregarding and having absolutely no appreciation for the role of the press in a national emergency like this. The media, they have a complete right to be able to report on a national tragedy like this. Everybody understands that these points are fraught with a lot of tension, emotions, and grief, and so on. We accept all of that. But what makes it very galling is that this strong-armed action by people like Minister McCoy, pretending as if they are interested in freedom of expression and respecting and recognizing the role of journalists, that's exactly opposite. And that sort of behavior is thuggish and should not be permitted. That is, we had every right to be on the grounds of the Umanayana. And on that day, we told our people to stand your ground and make sure you stay there. So when they were told that they had to leave, they remained in the vicinity and in the precincts of the Umanayana, and relatives who had gone there, bereaved relatives and frustrated and concerned relatives, spoke to them. So we still were able to do our job as we always try to do, even when we encounter hurdles. So, but in that case, the minister was completely out of order. And I would urge his prime minister, because he's there in the prime minister's office. Sometimes I really wonder what he's there doing in the prime minister's office. But it's really for the prime minister to show recognition of the fact that journalists have a right and a vital role in transmitting information. Because otherwise, the government has a sort of command style. They will only tell you what they would like to tell you. And because this was a major tragedy, they would like to sort of shape it in their own ways to sort of like to get their narrative out and whatever it is. So that was one incident that day. And then, of course, the other incident happened with Minister Anthony, where the reporter, again, intrepid, and that reporter was one of the first people to have gotten video of a survivor of that tragedy. And then she journeyed to the Essequibo Technical Institute, where the minister had, or where a holding station had been set up for survivors. And she was just simply standing on the side, listening to what was going on. But the minister had definitely encountered pushback from these people, because they were saying, we're not going anywhere until we hear about our loved ones and the people who are missing. And so he had to sort of try to counter that. And when he looked to his right, he saw the reporter and he said, who's this? And whatever it is, in a very brusque and a rough way. And then she said kindly, and very politely, I am from Kiskadi Watch. And he said, no, out. And she stood her ground and she waited there. Later, he then had two policemen, women, escort her out to the compound. And there again, she stood outside of the compound and spoke to people, continued with her job. So the message I would like to get across to both Minister Anthony and Minister McCoy is that no matter what it is you can do or you think you can do, we will continue to do our work. and you're out of order. This was not something that was within your remit. You are Minister of Health. You can take care of health matters and whatever it is. We have a vital role to report, and neither you nor Minister McCoy can stop us.
Yes, and as you say, we have a constitutional right to be for freedom of association and to freedom of expression. Just to stay on that point for a minute, Anand, I read also the statement of or a comment from the Guyana Press Association, Ivor Wharton, and she said, "We're not there to fight with the police or the government. The stories of the survivors have to be documented, and it is in no one's best interest to prevent survivors from sharing their experiences. It is through these stories that we are able to ask important questions." Wharton said, adding that false narratives about the disaster are already spreading online, which she said makes independent verification more urgent, not less. So in fact, if reporters are allowed to do their job, they are supporting the national commitment to a clear timeline, a clear story.
Yeah, it's just that the PPP doesn't recognize that. I mean, the government is always about command and control. They feel that if they control information, they can sort of like to shape the narrative in a certain way. And I would point out to you that after that helicopter crash that killed so many senior personnel in the army at the same time, the two survivors have still not been allowed to tell their stories to the public. They've been kept in close quarters by the GDF. And the reports on that inquiry has not been released because they do not want their feelings and the fact that there were issues as it relates to this new helicopter and perhaps its guidance and its piloting on that day. They don't want it to be out. So again, clear evidence that they would like to control information and not release it. And they have not released it up to now, despite the fact that Minister Edgehill had given a commitment to the press to have it released. They have not released that. So they've gone back in their words. Not only they haven't done it, they had committed to doing so, but they've broken their word too.
Thank you, Anand. I'd like us to shift now to our marine space, Guyana's marine space, or EEZ, Exclusive Economic Zone. So now this is now the international rules and conventions which apply, which Guyana has signed and ratified. One of them is the IMO's, International Maritime Organization's Casualty Investigation Code 2008, which makes it mandatory to have inquiry and investigation of the failures which allowed this tragedy to occur. Then we've also signed in Guyana, we've signed UNCLOS. We were very happy to have UNCLOS. It's Article 94, which again covers safety at sea for humans. UNCLOS was an important convention for Guyana because it led to the ITLOS ruling in our border demarcation, a maritime border with Suriname. Also, safety of life at sea, SOLAS, which requires independent investigation. So we've heard our government, Prime Minister Brigadier retired Mark Phillips talks about a commission of inquiry. And as Amansa Walton Desir, parliamentarian and leader of Forward Guyana Movement, said, and I'm going to just quote what she said, is the government proposing a commission of inquiry established under the Commission of Inquiry Act? Is it referring to the formal investigation provided under Part 18 of the Guyana Shipping Act? Or is it referring to the Maritime Safety Investigation mandatory under the IMO's Casualty Investigation Code 2008? So MP Amansa Walton Desir, she's a member of parliament, she's referencing one of these international conventions which Guyana has signed and ratified. How optimistic are you that we are going to have a well-run, independent, international commission of inquiry under any one of these laws, international or?
Yeah, so I'm not optimistic at all. On my private Facebook page, I posted yesterday, PPP, we need a proper commission of inquiry, no lapdogs, no soup drinkers, no place people, and so on, because I am not confident at all that President Ali is so inclined. You know, the commission of inquiry into the Madia dormitory fire was an enormous disappointment. It covered areas that, or it covered up areas that should have been addressed. It did not address responsibility of senior officials. And I don't believe that the government has unlearned that example. So I think in this case, given the gravity of the situation, this is the worst disaster involving Guyanese alone in the country's history. If you took Jonestown, it was nearly 900 Americans and a small number of Guyanese. This here, if the death toll is about 100, this is something that's going to go down in history as something that is blamed on negligence and other feelings of this government. So I think at the back of their minds, they're aware of that. And the fact that, international help has been involved here, the French, Brazilians, Trinidadians, it is a much greater thing. So it lessens the room for them to go to one of their police people and say, okay, let's do this and whatever it is. Because I think they are also going to be acutely aware that in the Northwest, where they have won a fair amount of support over the years, you may end up with about 70 families in communities that are absolutely bereaved from the loss here, and who will hold this against the government. And in future elections, they will say, no, this is not acceptable. You had us go on this ferry that was 87 years old. So they are looking, I'm sure, at the political calculus here, and they know they didn't have to come up with something that's proper. So it is quite possible that they may very well say, well, let's try to internationalize this. Let's have a jurist of eminence from some part of the Caribbean, and let's look at everything that has to be done. They'd also have to look at things like compensation, because it is clear that the state will have to have liabilities here as it relates to these people who've died. And yesterday, when we asked this question, when Kiskili Watch asked this question of the Prime Minister, he said, well, that will have to await the outcome of the Commission of Inquiry, which was not the pathway that they had used with the Mahdia, the victims of the Mahdia dormitory fire. While this thing was going on, while that Commission of Inquiry was going on, they were also trying to press them to accept settlements which were completely unacceptable. So I think here, with possibly 100 fatalities, they may see the need, and because they know they would like to assuage their communities in the Northwest, it's possible that they may have to go towards some sort of commission of inquiry that would have greater respect, and they will also have to observe all of these international conventions that would require investigations of various other areas. So the last thing you'd want them to do would be to look for scapegoats, and the scapegoating would be, who is the superintendent in charge of the loading? I mean, that is something that would clearly be a sign that they're looking for scapegoating, because all of those things, looking at the superintendent, there's also another act which we mentioned in one of the Kiskili Watch editorials. It's called the Shipping Casualties Investigation and Prevention Act, which makes allowance for every single voyage to be inspected by an inspector to see whether or not it seems this vessel is seaworthy, whether or not cargo has been properly packed, whether or not there's any overloading. But that does not happen at all. So it's one of those pieces of legislation that is observed in default. They just simply don't apply it. So I have a feeling here that they know they're under pressure and they have to deliver something that's different, but we have to wait to see. The Mahdia Commission of Inquiry was an enormous disappointment 3 years ago. I hope they've learned from that, and they will sort of look for some means of getting a credible thing done. They have the money, they have everything at their disposal. It's just really a matter for them moving in the direction of something that's going to be credible and something that will satisfy those 50 or 60 families that have lost multiple people. And they know that that is something that they're going to have to weigh, because the Northwest has been one of their recent strongholds.
For the benefit of our listeners who do not know, for whom Mahdia will not resonate, I will just explain that it was on the night of the 21st of May, 2023, when 20 Amerindian children in the care of the state in a state dormitory burned to death. And as you mentioned, Anand, that commission of inquiry assigned no faults except to the child, a little child who set the fire, who is astonishingly being charged and is still incarcerated 3 years later. So the Commission of Inquiry made no clear recommendations for future avoidance. And as you said, while this was going on, we had reportedly Peter Ramotar, then this regional executive officer, going to Mahdia, going to Kobe, offering to parents or getting many of the parents of those 20 children to sign to get the equivalent of 25,000 US dollars if their child had been burned to death, and to sign a piece of paper which said, no party to it admits to any liability as a result of the fire. I'm not sure how the parents would have been a party to that fire. And if your child had been burnt but not dead, you got the equivalent of 15,000 US dollars. So that kind of vulgarity and that sort of abomination, luckily, I think to his credit, the Chief Justice last month allowed the lawsuits which have been filed by some of the relatives of those burned children to proceed. But as you say, that was Mahdia. And now in the EEZ of Guyana, the exclusive economic zone, it's a game changer because we have not only these conventions, but we have ExxonMobil. We have we have Chevron, which paid 55 billion US dollars for a share of, to be part of that consortium, which is there. And so as a journalist, do you think ExxonMobil and Chevron, these multi-billion and trillion-dollar companies, are happy to see the ways in which, for example, the Maritime Search and Rescue Coordination Center, having no role to play whatever in reports that are issued about what happened? What were the steps? What's the timeline? What's your sense of this different global perspective?
Yeah. And you know, that's one of the other things about this tragedy that underlines the sham that we've been trying to sort of create. That is, with all of this oil money that you've had since 2019, there is no proper search and rescue network here that we could have brought to bear. You know, every time we discuss this, the possibility of some big disaster occurring in the Atlantic, either maybe associated with oil extraction or, ocean-going voyages of ferries and so on. And here on July 18th, we had the worst-case scenario. So what happens with the worst-case scenario? What actually happened when that occurred? Absolutely nothing. It was a disastrous response. It is something that we should be ashamed of. And it's something that the president, as a minister for a lot of these things, perhaps for petroleum and other things, should be held accountable. How did you begin rescuing these people on the high seas? That is, you had an emergency call at 11 o'clock, an SOS, and people pointed out that this thing went to the Timiri control center, but that there was meant to be also a GDF awareness system where they could have received the call right away. They are closer because they do have a Coast Guard base actually not very far from the area, and they should have been immediately deployed to rescue. So the rescues did not occur for at least 2 hours after the first SOS, because when we asked the Prime Minister about this, we asked what was the earliest rescue done of anybody, any of the survivors from this thing. And then he said something about 1:30 or the rescue vessel arrived around that time. So a rescue vessel did not arrive in the area for 2 and something hours, which by which time perhaps a lot of the people had already died. And quite a lot of the survivors we have spoken to said they spent 6, 7, and 8 hours underwater, including, I know, a child from Mali was charged with the arson. But there are so many uplifting stories about young children and how they battled to survive that night on the waters of July 18th. A 9-year-old girl rescued another child who was a complete stranger to her in the water. She was separated from her mother, and a smaller child held on to her. And, the presence of mind, she's somebody who could, maybe handle herself in the water, but she was able to sort of like to help this child to safety, even while she herself was separated from her mother. And it showed, this is what they had to rely on. So in this vast oil economy that aspires to be Dubai, and the president goes off to the Middle East and talks about where we've come over the time in terms of progress. And if we had a disaster in the Atlantic that occurred, let's say with ExxonMobil or something else, we would have been in the same situation. We would have had so little to be able to deploy to the scene, as was the case on July 18th, which is why perhaps the death toll is near to 100 or is likely to be 100. And the rescuing, we also asked again yesterday, how many people were rescued by the state and how many people were actually rescued by fishermen? Prime Minister said he had no idea because it actually did a lot more rescuing than the supposed search and rescue system that we are supposed to have. I think ExxonMobil and some of their other suppliers on the water did provide vessels in the end. But given our endowments and the fact that we've had all of this money come in, the fact that we did not have an adequate search and rescue, given that we do have regular ocean-going ferries, it again exposed this whole myth about we've made progress.
Editorials by Christopher Ram, by others. Any of them have been answered in any coherent fashion by the minister himself or by this organization which is set up to the Maritime Search and Rescue Coordination Center? Do these things exist as paper, or do this Maritime Search and Rescue Coordination Center, is it real?
Yeah.
Is the board of the Transport and Harbors Department real? Do they do any work? I know they get honoraria.
Yes.
What do they do?
Yes. Well, to his credit, I have to say that the Prime Minister has held 3 consecutive press conferences, which he's presided over. But like I said, when we've asked questions, like we asked if they can say how many were rescued by the Maritime Rescue Service that they had and how much by fishermen, they don't have answers here. And he does have several members of that Maritime Rescue set up at his press conferences, but they haven't really been able to provide the answers. And of course, quite a lot of the focus has been at those press conferences on ministerial accountability. In any jurisdiction where you have accountable governance, there is no way that a minister would have presided over a sector that could possibly have experienced 100 deaths, where there have been clear examples of 2 or 3 severe defects that would have come under his ministerial responsibility. And he has either not resigned or the president has not asked him to stand down. And neither of those 2 things has happened. Minister Edgehill has remained at those press conferences, being invited by the Prime Minister to be there. And the president has so far not addressed this thing about culpability and whether or not, even in terms of the fairness of a commission of inquiry and an investigation, that is, the minister should not be anywhere near this process. So those things then about, functioning boards and whether or not there's a board of the TNHD and whether or not they have discharged their functions are things that to be examined. What we have found with those boards, that they just simply sort of like are there as place keepers, but they don't actually sort of discharge the functions that they are meant to discharge. And in this case, we will see very quickly whether or not there's going to be any kind of accountability by all of them. The board of MARAD, if there is one that functions, the board of the TNHD, the head of MARAD himself, the Minister of Public Works, and the other associated bodies that will have to answer. The Coast Guard, for instance. What happened with the Coast Guard base on the night of that thing? Why wasn't the SOS received by the Coast Guard, which has a facility which is supposed to have a floating base in one area and which should have boats that should be immediately dispatched to the scene to be able to sort of rescue? Why weren't the life jackets handed out immediately after the SOS? Now, that really is the captain's responsibility and the role, the responsibility of the others on board. Now, was that done, or was just absolute chaos? Nobody knew where the life jackets were, so life jackets were floating on the sea, not in the reach of people who really needed them. Some people were able to grab on. So it made no sense to have 200 life jackets if they were not distributed at the emergency point in the 10 minutes before the thing actually began to capsize. So all of those things would expose the maritime bodies, and whether or not they can answer those things, we will see.
So Guyana Human Rights Association has issued a press release in which they talked about this, ideal commission of inquiry, how it should be composed. Family members, I think Kiskadi Watch also has done this. to have the confidence of family members as to its composition, to have the opposition opposition political parties represented. In an ideal world, or how confident are you that the criteria that will be used eventually, or that the government is thinking to use to set up its quote unquote commission of inquiry?
Yeah, I think they intend to do what they want to do. Like I said, the only caveats being they know that this here is a very sort of major circumstance with, a lot of extenuating circumstances. In one of the editorials we did for Fiscally Watch, I said there should have been an emergency session of Parliament on the Sunday after the incident. There should have been a convening of Parliament either the Sunday or Monday for full discussion on this and a commitment for bipartisanship in terms of the composing of the Commission of Inquiry. So if the government had recognized, and there's a letter we posted on the Kiswahili Watch website today about a letter writer who pointed out that in the 2005 Great Flood, there was an immediate mobilization of all forces, opposition, civil society, communities, and everybody. That was really what was required here. Immediately upon this disaster occurring, the president, of course, is outside of the country and was not accounted for at least 24 hours after. And we did raise this and so on. But you needed to have some sort of like national gathering of views and interests and commitment and solidarity. So in this case here, there should have been an emergency session of Parliament. There should have been an immediate bipartisan agreement on, well, let's decide how this is going to be done. Let's make sure we commit to all of these international conventions and agreements that we have to observe. And then we'll go about trying to see who we could agree should be the chair and maybe a 7-person commission. We'll reach out to CARICOM and the region and experts, like the one I mentioned in St. Lucia. They have maritime experts who they've mobilized. And we have a discussion. We reach out to the community that is most affected. We reach out to Port Pachuma, we reach out to Comaka and Namaruma and so on, in a way that they didn't do when they were doing the Mali Commission of Inquiry. That was what was required. I see no evidence of that so far. So I would be skeptical. The president has not said much. He's probably trying to sort of like to mobilize sympathy by being in the Northwest, which is good. However, we need to begin this process. How is this going to be done? You have a leader of the opposition. You should be engaging with him. You should be dealing with civil society. You should be dealing with the communities. And this should be a whole of society kind of approach and not Freedom House, which is how this government tends to operate.
So that reminds me, Anand, that in April and May of 2018, we had in Suriname's exclusive economic zone, 2 horrific attacks by quote unquote pirates. And that led to the loss of life of 17 sailors, workmen, and captains. 16 were Guyanese in 2 separate incidents. And if I recall, 12 of the bodies were never found of those fishers who were hacked to death and thrown overboard, some still alive. And what we saw in Suriname in 2018 was their parliament met, all the political parties, and they passed a unanimous motion calling on the Surinamese government to investigate, to compensate, to follow this issue, to bring justice for the murdered fishers in their exclusive economic zone. And a day after that happened, that was 10th of May, on the 11th of May, the Guyana's National Assembly met and also passed a motion calling for inquiry and justice for the dead. That was 8 years ago. And as you mentioned today, in spite of all the hollow words of one Guyana, what will it take to get the convening of our parliament to have a national focus and a national coming together for grief of this monumental tragedy?
Well, it would be unfortunate if it's this disaster that does it, but if it does, well then maybe that's the one silver lining. But unfortunately, the animus between the president and the opposition leader, I am not sure how that is going to play. because it is quite clear that this government does not intend to engage with the opposition leader at all unless he's been extradited and, they can engage with him, in some other place. But that is something that has to be gotten around here, because it is very important that we show unity and solidarity in terms of how we approach this. And the president must reach out to the opposition on this whole question of a commission of inquiry and, a sort of a mobilization of forces. I mean, the opposition leader has made the point of going, at the scene of this capsizing and has deployed boats to try to bring in bodies and so on. So at least he's trying to help. Surely the president should also reach out and say, well, fine, forget what is going on between us at a political level. We do have constitutional responsibilities. I'm the president and you're the leader of the opposition. We need to sort of put our heads together and we need to sort of find a way. We can make a joint trip to Region 1. We can go and try to present some sort of common view and try to provide solace to the communities there. It might be a little difficult to achieve, but that is the kind of healing that is needed. And that is a kind of, not gesture, that is a kind of meaningful presentation you have to make. When you're leaders, you do have to compromise with each other. And in the greater national good, you have to find a way to sort of reach out, because those communities in the Northwest are in deep agony. And it is indescribable when you listen to some of them. One family with 17 aboard, 7 survived, 9 died, and 1 is still missing. It's unbelievable. It's indescribable, and those people are left to their own devices. I know the minister said she'll have permanent counseling there, but what we did find out in Nadia was permanent counseling is always promised, but whether or not it's actually there, it's a different story.
And I think on that point that you've just mentioned about, it isn't just even not meeting with the leader of the opposition, but what I've seen posted or what I've read is Azzuddin Mohammed found some bodies, alerted the Coast Guard, and 3 hours later, they had not arrived, no official boat to pick them up. So it's a level of vindictiveness, if it is true, that makes you despair for Guyana. Yes. So, Anand, we're almost out of time. The last thing I wanted to ask you is what many Indigenous people have been saying online and in outrage, and they are disgust at the performance of grief, the performative aspect, the way this tragedy is being treated. So there was a prayer vigil last night at the seawalls, and the invitation, which I received, said, suggested attire, white. That landed like a thud for people who are sleeping on the floor of the MV Barima, waiting hours before it would get go, and then they lose, as you say, 9 family members. What do you make of this performance of that charade that went on at the seawall?
Yeah,
and locking up someone who has Charlene Nagir, who just holding a sign.
Yeah. So that was completely out of order. That is preventing her from holding that up, completely out of order, a violation of Article 147. And the other part about this is the exact pattern with the Mahdia the performative acts, because on 2 occasions they flew diplomats and a whole series of people into Mahdia at great expense, when they could have taken that money and given it to those Mahdia families instead of sort of forcing them into some little deal. So here they've gone and done the same thing again, a big show at the seawall. It's okay to show grief, but you don't have to do that. All of that money you're spending should go to the families in Region 1. Every single cent of that. We don't need to see your grief in Georgetown. We need you to help those families that need the help.
Yes. Anand Persod, Editor-in-Chief of Kiskadi Watch. We can go on for a longer time, but thank you so much. And thank you as well for keeping this issue close and for continuing to report on this monumental tragedy for our country, the drowning of perhaps 100 souls on the night of the 18th of July at midnight, just 7 miles from our coast. Thank you, Anand.
Yeah, thank you very much, Janet. It's a pleasure.